I see my videos of Dominican Yves Kungar has really ignited some debate. Some people looking at him as extremely modernist, heretical, and so on. And again, I would ask people that are listening and engaging with this channel, you can't just boil down a person to one moniker or one view or one label. And certainly for when you're reading Kungar, you just cannot boil him down to this. I'm sure if Kungar was alive today, he'd have some interesting advice to give to the church, since what has happened over the last 30 years, especially what we've seen in the synodal process coming out in Rome. It's amazing where we've arrived to in the church. Can you imagine? But I digress here in a sense that, I just wanted to engage a little bit people into this discussion on Kungar, and how we move forward in the church. And there's this video that somebody sent me on that the Orthodox had, an Orthodox priest, I'm just pull up his name here, Father Peter Hares, did on Kungar, and kind of showing this video to me. Look what Kungar has ultimately done. He's destroyed the faith. He's done this. Let me just play you this video, and I'm coming with some commentary on it, and I want to drive a little bit of a debate and a discussion on this, because you cannot reduce Kungar to just modernist and completely disregard his thought, completely disregard everything. He says, no, I'm not going to read anything on Kungar, I'm not going to listen to him, I'm not going to look at him. Well, that's a great pity, because in order to understand where we are today, we have to read how we got here, and we have to learn, because not everything Kungar was saying was wrong. Not everything that Kungar is, some of the stuff that he's asking us to think about, is relevant, is important, and has to and should challenge us, and has to challenge us, if we love the faith. So anyway, let me just go through this video. I thought it was very interesting, but I want to just interject with some of my commentary as a Catholic who did look at orthodoxy, who did consider some of these questions. I just want to interject into this conversation a little bit, and to drive a conversation in the church now. How do we move forward, and what is the path out of the current crisis in the church? But anyway, I just want to walk you through this. It's going to be a little bit long, so apologies, but I think this type of discussion is relevant for today.
And this dovetails into what we're going to be quoting from, and we see in the very important book, should be well known to a lot of scholars who have studied this issue. After 900 years, that's where I got the title for this podcast tonight, by Yves Kungar, the father of Vatican II's ecclesiology, very important scholar of the 20th century. So the great ecclesiologist for Catholicism in the 20th century, in his book, says very, very interesting things about this time period that we're looking at, the 10th, the 11th and 12th century. It's extremely important to understand what happened and why there was a deep division. From 1075 to 1175, he says the West profoundly altered its piety. Why? Why then and not 975 or 875 or 1375? Right after the schism, Kungar says we have a great break. Listen to what he says. A Christian of the 4th or 5th century would have felt less bewildered by the forms of piety current in the 11th century than would his counterpart of the 11th century in the forms of the 12th. So 11th to the 1000s to the 1100s, you see a massive change, a massive disruption, alteration, a break. And what's important here is this happens only in the West, he says. The great break occurred in the transition period from one to the other century. Why? Well, why would that happen? There's only one reason. There's only one reason ultimately. This change took place only in the West. Why didn't it happen in the East? Why didn't it happen among the Orthodox? Sometime between the end of the 11th and end of the 12th century, everything was somehow transformed. That somehow transformed points us to some mystery. It's a mystery here. And the mystery is in the realm of our relationship with God. It's in the realm of the spiritual life, right? This profound, and he's talking about piety, forms of piety, he says. This profound alteration of view did not take place in the East, where in some respects Christian matters are still today what they were then. He says right up to today, right up into the 40s, 50s, and 60s that he's writing, the Orthodox East is the same as it was 1,000 years ago, 900 years ago. And what they were in the West before the end of the 11th century. So he clearly is pointing to a common faith, a common experience, a common piety when they were still Orthodox in Rome. And right after that, within 100 years, massive disruption, profoundly altered, profound break with the past, and only in the West. It's phenomenal to read this and then to wonder how Kungar at that point didn't turn around and walk to the East immediately.
So, obviously he's framing this from the Orthodox point of view and framing it to defend the Orthodox Church's view. And we have Kungar pointing out some points here that he's picked up on as justification for why we should turn to the Orthodox Church and become Orthodox. Now, I face this exact same question and problem because I was drawn into Orthodoxy. I love the Orthodox Church. I've been to Mount Athos. I admire the way they practice the faith, their liturgy, and so forth. But the crunch of the matter came when, yes, the church has been under scholasticism since the era of St. Thomas Aquinas. And our faith can be so scholastic that we forget the heart. That we forget that the faith is an actual encounter with a living God. Okay? And in Orthodoxy, they do focus on this. They do focus on, the prayer of the heart, Hesychasm, the monastic experience, the lived practical experience, not the classroom, scholastic, intellectual side. We can be so intelligent. We can be so intelligent, so knowledgeable, intellectually knowledgeable of the faith that we actually don't have faith. That simply something happened. And in the church, you could make the argument in the Catholic Church that we were so scholastic in our formation that we forgot how to actually form our heart. The path of the path of sanctification starts with the heart, has to start with the heart. You have to start with the ordinary man. And the faith is for the ordinary man. Christ came and he catechized the ordinary, everyday, working man of his era in Galilee, in Nazareth. Of his era. He didn't go to Jerusalem to get the already learned so that they would be here. And he could have done that. He was God. He is God. He could have done that. But he chose the ordinary, everyday fisherman as such, the ordinary man to give the faith to. And just on this topic, there is a man, Michael O'Carroll, and he has tackled this, he has spoken about this in his book, Ascent of Man to God. Ascent of Man to God, answering the Vatican II period, acquiring Christian perfection and the universal call to holiness, because we're all called to holiness. So, why didn't I become Orthodox? Because he's asking the question on Kungar, realizing this, why didn't you become Orthodox? Because since the 10th century, since the schism, there has been incredible saints in our church talking specifically about the points that Kungar is talking about, in the sense that, We had a break, according to Kungar. Now, this could be debated, and you could have people debating this on different Catholic channels. But the reason why I ultimately never became Orthodox, didn't go to that Eastern tradition, is because, Christ didn't abandon the Catholic Church after 1,000 years. Christ's presence, his sanctifying presence, is present in the Catholic Church, in the lives of people like St. John of the Cross. If you read St. John of the Cross and the experience he had of sanctification, of deification, theosis, his lived experience. And this is what we need to repropose to the world today. The faith can be for somebody who has 2 doctorates in theology, or the faith can be for the farmer that has never read a book or doesn't know how to read. God can come in and give his experience, his lived present. How am I going to say? God can come in and reveal himself to the soul of those 2 men in the same way. Can do, if he wants to. It's a grace. At the end of the day, it's all God's grace. God, this is what we need to humbly understand. God can do this, and he does do this. And so, I suppose, yes, we could say that there is this straitjacket of scholasticism that we over-intellectualized our faith to such an extent that we forgot about what the Orthodox do, is very much focus on the heart. If you go to Mount Athos, that's the first thing that's going to tug at you, is this lived heart experience of the faith. The monks coming and bringing you something to eat. The monks getting up to pray in the morning, this ora et labora, you very much find it's still present in the church. It just didn't disappear. The Benedictine rule of life and method of life, which comes from Saint Cassian, from the east as well. That for Saint Basil and so forth, all of that rhythm of life, that method of sanctification didn't just disappear in after 1,000 years. It's still present in the church. So I think Kungar, okay, he's making some arguments here in that specific book, which you could debate. But why we don't become Orthodox? Because in the Catholic Church we just didn't disregard the tradition of the first 1,000 years. It still remained in the church. It still remained in the Carmelite spirituality. It remained in Benedictine monastic spirituality, Carthusians, etc., etc., etc. It is there. It wasn't wiped away. That's my impression anyway on it. Now, after Vatican II, things we can have a little bit debate where we are today. But I mean, up for debate. Let me know in the discussion what you think. But that's why the study. So why didn't I become Orthodox? Was from Saint Teresa of Avila, Saint John the Cross, Saint Teresa of Lisieux, and the Benedictine, the monastic spiritual Saint Bruno. All of these saints that profoundly had a conversion and a heart loved experience of our Lord Jesus Christ. Still there. Anyway, I'll just go on with this video and I'll interject as I move.
I'm not sure what you can do when you have such an obvious witness and confirmation from such a stalwart of contemporary Catholicism and of Vatican II Catholicism, right? One of the fathers of Vatican II. He doesn't understand, or maybe he does understand, but for whatever reason, he doesn't make it doesn't take it to its obvious conclusion. Now, from 1075 to 1175, he says we have transitions in the West. Let's look at quickly. There's much more in the book. You can find it free online if you're interested. Transitions in the West. He says from a predominantly essential and exemplarist outlook to a naturalistic one, an interest in existence. So we have a change from the old ways, the old world understanding, right? Essential outlook, exemplars, to a naturalistic one. And by the way, that becomes apparent very quickly in the art form. The Orthodox iconography is almost immediately lost in the West. That which was common in East and West, the Church of Rome supported very much the Seventh Ecumenical Council and defended the icons. So what happened, that within 200 years, by the 1200s, you pretty much have a transformation in terms of art. And that is partly what he's talking about here. From a symbol to dialectic, another massive change that people are still talking about today. And this is a part of what makes the modern world, the Western rationalistic world, is that they left symbol and they embraced the dialectic, right? From a synthetic perception, synthetic, unified perception, to an inclination for analysis, questions, putting things under the microscope, right? And analyzing them rationalistically.
I can understand where he's coming from, in the sense that, Catholic scholasticism, is a very much a manual work. And you have the great works of St. Thomas Aquinas and other Catholics in the church trying to explain, to dissect, to put under the microscope the spiritual life. And how you do that is it's interesting. And I suppose I'll go back to the fundament of our faith. And this is my assessment of it anyway, is that our faith is an encounter with a person, is an encounter with God, is an encounter with a living God, is an encounter with God that is present to me now, today, is an encounter with his body, blood in our liturgy. Now, how you put him under a microscope and talk about him, whereas we need to be talking about our encounter with him. And that's my thoughts on it, because, as I said, the Catholic faith is for everybody. It's not just for somebody that's gone through a seminary formation. The personal encounter with Christ is a gift that's given to every heart. And so, that's why the Catholic mystics, the Carmelite mystics, they're an incredibly important resource for us at this moment in time in the church, because they talk about the encounter with the divine, about the heart-to-heart conversation, and that's incredibly beautiful. And so, on from the Dominican side, and I hope I can understand where Eve's Kungar is coming from, because for 800 years we had scholasticism, which is really important. But the core of our faith is an experience. It is it's the encounter of our humanity with God's divinity. It's that encounter. It's that. And I go back to my own experience on this. When I was 18, I've spoken to about it before, and I asked Christ, "Do you love me?" And his actual audible reply was, "Of course I love you." Now, I rejected that, thinking, "Look, I can't. How can Christ love me? How can he come forward and reveal his love for me in an audible, physical, emotional way and captivate me?" I rejected that, because I said, that's not for me. I am not worthy. I'm not a saint. I'm not a mystic. That's not how God works. But at the age of 50, 32 years later, from that experience, I'm thinking, that is how God works. God steps in and he reveals his love for us, and he takes us by the hands spiritually, and he leads us to his kingdom, to his Father. He brings us along, and I'm convinced of this. I'm absolutely convinced of this. That God's entry into our lives is for everybody. For the most intelligent, for the least intelligent, for the most informed ones. And so, I understand how church fathers and theologians grappled with all of these questions. Because, as I said, I've known the most prepared theologians, writing books, incredible men intellectually, and never had a heart-to-heart encounter with Christ, never had their hearts formed. And their hearts were aching, and their hearts were lost. Their interior was lost. Yes, all up here, nothing down here. And the way forward in the church is the formation of hearts. It really is. It's the formation of prayer. I do encourage people, Jean Curie, the School of Mary, the work that he's doing over in England is really important for this time. It's the homework that we should be doing on getting back to this great tradition and mystery of our faith. The heart. The heart, you start there. So we need to be putting people into communities to work on your heart. And then, the head. That's my thought on it anyway. But yeah, we'll see.
And he says here we have the beginning of scholasticism. Very interesting. Right then at the end of at the time of the schism. It's already set almost immediately. From a culture where tradition reigned and the habit of synthesis became ingrained to an academic milieu, where continual questioning and research was the norm and analysis the normal result of study. All right, so totally different. Why do we have a very different way of understanding the life in Christ and theology and orthodoxy compared to Catholicism in the West? This is not an accident. It has to do with a break from the life of the church, a walking away from the unity of the church and all that entails, including what it entails with respect to the grace of God. And it's not an accident, as we'll see later, that they end up talking about grace as a created reality. That grace, which is uncreated, which is God alone, as we'll see, talk later on about it is created reality. Why? How's it possible? Well, here's one of the things that leads there. The whole change in mentality in the West within 100, 120, 150 years.
He's there talking about grace, and I just thought I'd read you, because some Orthodox don't actually know what us Catholics believe. And in our catechism in 1997, it says, grace is a participation in the life of God. That's what grace is. It introduces us into the intimacy of the Trinitarian God. By baptism, the Christian participates in the grace of Christ, the head of his body, as an adopted son. Remember, when Christ rose from the dead and appeared to Mary Magdalene, he says, I ascend to my Father and your Father. We become adopted children of God. He can henceforth call God Father in union with the only Son. He receives the life of the Holy Spirit, who breathes charity into him and who forms the church. Now, I don't know how any Orthodox could say that is not traditional, apostolic traditional. Sometimes I hear the Orthodox kind of getting annoyed in some debates that we actually have a catechism, but that is traditional Christianity. That is traditional Orthodoxy, in my opinion. Now we can debate this. Maybe scholasticism is expressing it in the wrong way, because Orthodox, they don't believe in transubstantiation, but they believe that during divine worship, in what they when the priest says, "This is my body, which is given up for me," when he says those words of consecration, that the body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ is present. The vocation to eternal life is supernatural. It depends entirely on God's gratuitous initiative. That is the same thing as what the Orthodox believe. It is entirely on God's gratuitous initiative, for he alone can reveal and give himself. It surpasses the power of human intelligence, intellect, and will, as that of every other creature. We can't know God. We can't obtain salvation. We can't enter heaven on our own will. It is entirely a gift of God, and it is Him that reveals Himself. It's Christ that comes into our life. And I think, it's just to interject there in that concept of grace. Yes, 1,000 years of scholasticism has given us a way of thinking and of expressing ourselves, but I would maintain that we, as Catholics, we do have the Orthodox faith as well. We do have the Orthodox faith, and Christ has not been absent. But anyway, just thought I'd kind of inform Catholics, and if you want to know what we believe on grace, any Orthodox listen to us. In our catechism, it's grace, and it's 1996, 997, 998, 1999. Very important chapters to read. And I'd love, maybe the Orthodox and the Catholic theologians can give us a discussion on what you believe there.
The East followed the road of tradition. This is Kungar writing. The East followed the road of tradition. Interesting. And we have shown how one of the principal differences among the various peoples of the Orthodox faith is, in fact, that they are not trained, as are the Latins, by the schools. Right? And that's very true. Really, until the 19th and 20th century, when you have an explosion of an imitation of the West in terms of academic theology in our schools or Orthodox sources, but even then, the saints reject that. Let's look at St. Paisius Veloskovsky in the 18th century. He goes to theological school in Kiev and walks out within a couple of months and says, this is a dead end. This is not orthodoxy. This is not the patristic theology I want. He leaves for Mount Athos, the center of the church for the last 1,000 years. He leaves for Mount Athos because that's not how it's done. That never was how it's done. We didn't have the theology was not a matter of rational analysis, but of experience, of prayer, right?
I agree with that. I actually agree with that. Theology has to stem from your experience of God. Obviously firmly rooted in the scriptures, in tradition, in discernment, in the lives of the saints, and the tradition of the church. I would just disagree from that Orthodox point of view that didn't happen in the Catholic Church. It did, and that's why I go back. If you read the lives of the mystics in the Catholic Church, Saint Catherine of Siena and other different saints, very humble. They talk about their experience with God. St. John of the Cross is writing from his experience. St. Teresa of Avila is writing from her experience. St. Teresa of Lisieux also writes from her experience. And there are various saints along that do the same. I would also contend that St. Thomas Aquinas also, to some extent, had that same experience. And some of them, they're trying to explain it, but you can take it to such an extent that the theology is all intellectual and no experience, and that can happen, it has happened, and that's why we have, as I said, I've met people that have doctorates in theology, known priests, doctors in theology, but don't actually have an experience of God. That actually haven't experienced God, and you see it through their lives. They end up so intellectualized. And I remember one particular theologian, doctor in theology, in a Catholic university, but he didn't know how to pray. Yeah, he didn't actually know how to pray, and that's why it's important that we need schools of prayer. We need schools of prayer so that we can be brought into that incredible experience of knowing God. And then you write about your theology is built upon the knowledge of God. I mean, I think you see that through the Philokalia, the book that the Orthodox have compiled, and we can't just reject this. So there has to be this renewal in the church, and that's why as I said with Mike Carroll, his book. I do ask people to read it, The Ascent of Man to God, answering the Vatican II period and the doctrine of acquiring Christian perfection and the universal call to holiness. Because I do think that's what, in a way, Vatican II, if you read the documents correctly, there is that ask for the universal call to holiness, and there is this call to a renewed direction in how we form people in the faith. Of course, there are structures and there are important methods in doing this. For example, how we educate our young, how we bring our kids up in good Catholic education, and it's crazy in our schools. We've completely destroyed that preparation that we should be giving our kids. But I think in the hand of God is in all of this. That's just my thought. And again, I know this video is going to cause a lot of discussion, so I'd be interested to see your feedback on it.
So that's what he's telling us here. Kungar is saying this is what was going on among the Orthodox. They weren't interested in cultivating excessively, like philosophers, the rational intellect. They were interested in experiencing God firsthand. And from that experience then flowed rivers of theology, right? He says the East knew no scholasticism of its own and was to experience neither the Reformation or the 16th and 18th century rationalism. All those stages of the Renaissance and the so-called Enlightenment, which was the darkening of the West. And all these things didn't happen in the East, didn't happen among the Orthodox. We're getting it basically shoved down our throat for the last 200 years, especially after the Russian Revolution. It's been violently imposed upon the Orthodox peoples by forced assimilation, by bayonet and gunpoint under the Russian Revolution and all the rest, right? Through persecution and decimation of the church. And it's this tyrannical spirit of the West, of rationalism and pride that took over the West, especially after the Enlightenment, now has been forced upon the whole world, this one way of thinking and living. He's telling us right here that this is where it is the onset. This is the origin of all this. In other words, the East remained foreign to the three influences that shaped modern Catholicism. We could talk all the day about minor differences, and most people who looked at Orthodoxy and look at Catholicism, that's what they do. Oh, well, I wonder if the Pope is right. Well, if the Pope's right, then I'll become Roman Catholic. You're missing it. You're missing it. You're missing it. It's not on that level. It's much deeper. We got to understand the deeper differences and the deeper life and how different the life is in Christ to understand then in the proper context these dogmatic additions in the West and the dogmatic differences and of stances today. So, in other words, again, the East remained foreign to the three influences that shaped modern Catholicism. And the question is, why did they shape modern Catholicism? Where do they come from? He tells us right here. It's this time period when things start to change in the West. And why do they start to change? It's pretty obvious. They start to change because they walked away from the unity and the theology and the experience of the church of the first millennium.
I don't think the Western Church walked away from the unity and experience of the first millennium. Obviously, he's an Orthodox priest. He's defending his theological views, and he's using Kungar to reinforce his views. But I don't think that's the necessary experience. And you can just look at the lived experience of the saints in the church over the last 1,000 years in the West to see that there are incredible saints that have guided and helped the church. That's the reality. And as I said, you can look at the patrimony that we have in the West. But I can understand his points that he's raising on this. So just to point defending the Catholic Church on my side on that.
The West chose rationalism over Hesychasm. What's Hesychasm? Hesychasm is the way of the hesychast, of the ascetics, the way of those who go deep in prayer.
So he's saying we chose intellectualism over hesychasm. Now, hesychasm as a term has come to the fore in the 1300s. St. Gregory Palamas I have to disagree with saying that we chose one over the other. Very much, uh, you see, maybe not in the same structure, Hesychasm, that you have in Mount Athos, but very much that prayer life exists in the West as well. And I do challenge him. If you look at the monastic tradition in the West, Saint Benedict, Saint Bruno, the Carmelite spirituality, it is very much there. It is very much this prayer of the heart can be found in the West. My opinion on it, anyway. Did scholasticism dominate? Okay, we can have that view, but it's not like it was chosen one over the other. And as I said, Hesychasm, and the controversy, let's say, developed after the schism, developed in the 1300s. But I don't think it's absent in the West.
And unite themselves to God in the church. That's the core of the Orthodox Church, the hesychast, the one who is in the stillness of God, like it came to the prophet Elias in the Old Testament, the still small voice. That stillness is where we encounter God and we go deep and we become true theologians.
He's talking about the prophet Elijah. I suppose he probably doesn't know that in the Carmelite spirituality, they hold him as their spiritual father. And you very much see in the Carmelite spirituality in the West a lot of what you could identify with the Hesychast prayer in the East.
The West chose rationalism, to develop this thing excessively, and think that by developing this thing, we're going to reach God. In fact, this is when you develop this excessively, you become proud and arrogant. It's the opposite of what you need to do to reach God, right? It certainly is a tool, a very powerful tool. We use it all the time. But it's one thing to have that at the center and at the forefront, and for that to be trained and developed and built up, and for the soul and the spirit and the heart to be built up. It's not the same thing, right? So the West, he says, chose rationalism over the monastic life, the ascetic life. He says, therefore, the West has evolved towards a type of analytical knowledge, which in some is rational. Rationalism. It needs to define the exact shape of things, to see them independently of one another. It's an analytical stance. Divide them, analyze them, compartmentalize them. None of that is what was going on in the first millennium, and it goes on in the Orthodox Church, right? In the first half of the 13th century, or should, right? We're all under the weight of rationalism today everywhere. In the first half of the 13th century, a new kind of theological teaching and study appeared and established itself in the West. He's talking about scholasticism. Until this time, the dominant type of teaching or study had been of a contemplative or monastic nature, linked with the liturgical life of the abbeys and cathedrals. Now there was added a new type of teaching and study, an academic and rational nature, which was soon to take the place of the former. So it didn't coexist. It's tyrannical, the rationalistic spirit. It does not allow for those who live according to the Spirit. They're at war with one another. And unfortunately, in the West, they succumb to that. And he says it right there, not me, but the father of the Second Vatican Council's ecclesiology. So that is huge. I think anybody who is serious about understanding the difference between Orthodoxy and Catholicism needs to understand what we just went over. Now,
he is saying that they didn't coexist in the West. Well, sorry, I have to push back on that. We wouldn't have authors of St. John of the Cross, St. Teresa of Avila, St. Catherine of Siena. We wouldn't have St. Ignatius giving us the spiritual exercises. We wouldn't have these great saints if we had only allowed scholasticism, if our faith was just purely intellectual, scholastic driven. Because a purely intellectual understanding of God doesn't change lives. If you're an idea of God won't change your heart. Ideas don't, ideas, some ideas can be very interesting, but what moves hearts is another heart. And so, Christ's heart in the church hasn't been absent. And I think he forgets one pivotal key moment in the West during the last 1,000 years is the devotion to the Sacred Heart. It is Père Monial. And Roger Buck, the author Roger Buck, the gentle traditionalist, he talks about this intervention by God into the West, Christ revealing his Sacred Heart to Margaret Mary Alacoque, in Père Monial. It is probably one of the greatest interventions that God made in the Western Church in the last 1,000 years, to reveal this love in this visible way, this icon, so I know some Orthodox, they try to paint us Catholics as being completely scholastic, completely this, but Christ's this hesychast, this heart, this experimental heart-to-heart encounter with Christ is present and did continue in the West, and Christ has remained present, and that's why I didn't become Orthodox, because I'd have to renounce the Sacred Heart. I'd have to renounce our great Western saints. That did they not encounter Christ? Do we not have that wealth in our church? And the Second Vatican II has had a lot of discussion, and Kungar is hated by many traditional Catholics. Hated so much that they won't even read him, and they don't know what he actually did say and what he was actually trying to do. And I don't think you can reduce Kungar to just one book or one phrase or one paragraph or one intervention. His thought is so broad. Like St. Pope Benedict, if we look at the young Pope Benedict and the old Pope Benedict, his thought process changed over his life. The young Pope Benedict would have been very much on par with Pope Francis. And if you dig out some of Pope Benedict's earliest writings, they could be very much on par with Pope Francis. But the old Pope Benedict had a very different thinking. And like Kungar, I think he's one of the most pivotal theologians of the last 100 years, and you can't just ignore him. But an Orthodox have picked up on this, but I just want to hit back, and give my views, because he's saying, well, why didn't Kungar become Orthodox? Why don't Catholics embrace Orthodoxy? Because we have to learn from how God has guided the Catholic Church in the last 1,000 years. We have to learn, and yes, there are things that we need to be careful of. But I think theology at its roots has to be based on the experience of God. The actual experience of God. That has to be the fundament of theology. Obviously, theology based on scripture, based on sacred tradition, based on what has gone before. But we have to know God in order to give God to this world. We have to go into our heart, encounter God, speak with him, talk to him, know how he works, know how his Spirit works, know the fruits of the Spirit. And we have 2,000 years of patrimony, East and West, on this. And I do appreciate orthodoxy, and I do love Laudatus, and I do love what the tradition that the monks have preserved in Mount Athos, but that it wasn't completely absent from the Catholic Church. And as I said, that intervention from heaven in Père Monial testifies to that. Christ didn't reveal himself to a theologian, he revealed himself to a nun, and he gives her this, and it was Jesuits who propelled this into this this devotion into the West, Christ's Sacred Heart. What could be more precious? My thoughts on it. Anyway, let me know what you think in the discussion below on this. And again, I'm not a theologian, so if I've got stuff wrong, I do apologize. But the more I think about it, the more I know that this to be true. Our Catholic faith, this encounter with Christ, is a gift that Christ gives to all, if we're willing to accept it. The faith can be for the most learned theologian or for the man, milking the cows. And the experience of God that a great theologian has, that has written hundreds of books, or the experience of God that a man has while milking cows, is the same, can be the same, because the core of our faith is a Sacred Heart, is a heart-to-heart conversation. And that's my thoughts on it anyway. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments. Just wanted to come back on Kungar, and some people quoting this video by the Orthodox on Kungar, and others saying, oh, he was uber liberal. I think I don't think you can box Kungar into such a reductionist view. I think he's greater than just one book or one thing. But anyway, God bless you. Take care. Bye bye.